Hello and welcome to this month's webinar entitled I Ain't Afraid of No Goats, Communication Skills for the Relationship Challenged. This is Gary Sams once again, the Chief Wellness Officer for beBetter Health, and I'm really pleased to be with you this month to talk about another important topic, communications. Now, before I actually get into the heart of this, I think I have to spend a little time talking about this title that I chose this month. So my first title, and really the actual title of this presentation, should probably be Simple Rules for Becoming a More Effective Communicator at Home and Work. But that didn't really have much of a ring to it, so I had to go with something completely different. And I'll give you a little insight into why, and it's kind of wrapped up into rule number one here, and that is talking is different from listening, and what we say is sometimes different from what someone hears. And so the story behind this is that some of you that'll be listening to this, I'm sure, are old enough to remember this movie. It came out in the mid-'80s, I think, very popular, called Ghostbusters. And I know it was actually just remade, I think, this past year with another all-female cast. Full disclosure, I haven't had an opportunity to see that version. But in the original version, Ghostbusters, they had this kind of clever byline that said, I ain't afraid of no ghost. And many years ago, when my kids were still much younger, for some reason, that movie was being replayed on television, and my daughter was somehow watching a part of it or what have you, and she evidently heard that kind of catchphrase in the movie, I ain't afraid of no ghost. But for some reason, she thought that they were saying, I ain't afraid of no goats, which is kind of ironic because, if some of you may recall from some of my other presentations, I'm a goat farmer. And so I was happy that she wasn't afraid of no goats. But in talking to her years later about this, and kind of reminding her how she thought that they were saying, I ain't afraid of no goats, and she was walking around the house kind of singing that little jingle. I had to remind her that they were saying I ain't afraid of no ghost, and that's kind of a little joke that we have, particularly if now the tables are a little bit turned and she's asking me to do something for her, and maybe if I don't understand completely or I don't follow her directions to the letter, I'll just sort of turn it on her and say, well, Kaylee, I ain't afraid of no goats. And she kind of gets the point that somehow our communications broke down and that what she said wasn't necessarily what I heard. So that's a little bit of a long explanation for the title. Rule number two is probably more important, and that is we can learn to be better communicators. And I think we'll all agree that effective communication is really key to success in any relationship that we have, and that includes our home life, our work life, whatever it is. We need to be effective communicators. And so where I want to start today is with being better listeners, so that we're not hearing goats when they're saying ghost, to continue that little story. We're hearing what someone is saying, and I really like what Larry King has to say about this. And most of us are probably aware Larry King, very famous interviewer of people of all walks of life, and had a very popular show on for many years. And he said, I remind myself every morning that nothing I say this day will teach me anything. So if I'm going to learn, I must do it by listening. So being a good listener is a great place to start in our desire to be better communicators. And the tips that I'm going to go over here are involved with a skill, a specific skill called active listening. And by active listening, we mean fully concentrating on what is being said rather than just passively hearing the words the person you're speaking with. And so here's some tips to follow around being a better active listener. So the first one, be mindful of the process involved in listening. And that really means, being focused. So we talk about mindfulness all the time, and being present in the moment. And that's really an important trait when it comes to being a good communicator and being a good active listener. Being present in the moment and having focus. In order to do that, we have to be mindful of this next bullet, which is don't judge or prejudge the conversation. And I think that's particularly true when we're talking about maybe an important conversation that we know that's coming up or that we have planned, and we have some expectations around the outcome of the conversation. And we may have a tendency to judge or prejudge the conversation because we're kind of looking for a specific outcome. And so it's important to try not to do that. And that's important if we are going to be present in real time in the conversation at the moment. This next bullet, confirm what you heard and get acknowledgement from the speaker. So the notion of paraphrasing back. I heard you tell me that you really like me to, and then whatever that is, and sort of paraphrase back to the speaker what it is that you heard. And that allows them to acknowledge and confirm that you were correct in your hearing. I'm going to bring that point up again in our different presentation or our communication skills at home and at work, because that's something that we're going to use more than once. Show that you're listening through your body language. Likewise, body language is going to come up in the next two slides in our different communication forums, whether at work or home, because that's an important component of active listening. So being attentive, having eye contact, looking and listening with our eyes, as well as listening with our ears and speaking verbally, that's very important. So body language is something that we need to be attending to, and our willingness to ask questions. I think that's really important. The questions can lead to better and more in-depth communications and understanding. So certainly do that. Okay, now I'm going to shift a little bit from the general to some specific settings where communication is obviously very important. And the first one I want to talk about is communication at work. And I'm going to focus this a little bit more on communicating with someone maybe that you're reporting to, but it's also very relevant to general communication with your coworkers, or maybe if you have someone reporting to you, these are some tips that you can pass on that help them be a more effective communicator in regards to their relationship with you. And I have rule number 3 here, and there's a difference between you statements and I statements. So I'm going to start with that one. And I think this is an important one. And the difference is, just think of these two different examples. If you start with, I thought I heard you tell me that you wanted, and you can continue that any way that you want to, versus you told me that you wanted, and it's subtle, but you see the differences there. And what we've come to find out is that when we start a statement with I think, that gives the person that you're communicating with a little bit of breathing room as far as not having to feel like, oh wait, did I say something wrong, when you start the conversation with you told me. In some cases that can put the person on the defensive. So again, there's a difference between those two statements, and my recommendation is to start with an I statement when you're starting an important conversation. Now that first bullet point, rehearse, I think that's really based on how important the conversation is. Now obviously you don't rehearse all your communications with your boss or co-workers, but if you're talking about something that's really important and important to you, I would recommend rehearsing it. It gives you an opportunity to sort of hear yourself communicate your points and so forth, and I think it also helps with some of these other points that we're going to get to. The third bullet point, note your body language. We've talked about that already, but that's important in this setting. Avoid fidgeting, looking at the floor, at your phone. You want to make eye contact with the person. You want to be confident yet relaxed, and that helps to kind of set the stage for effective interaction. Listening well, to our skill of active listening, same thing here. It's important to not only get your point across and say what you need to say, but also listen very effectively to what your supervisor has to say. And if you need to, take notes. I think that's a good tool, and it also lets the person know that you're really, this is important to you, what they're saying, and you're really making notes to make sure that you get it all. The next bullet, staying calm, obviously very important, because if we're too emotional, if we're frustrated or angry, that really distracts and detracts away from what it is that we're trying to say and how we're really trying to get through to someone. So staying calm is an important attribute. The last one, be a problem solver. Present your ideas, thoughts, possible methods of improvement instead of just complaining. I can really relate to this one. I've had the good fortune of I was the CEO of my company for a long time, and I had over 100 people reporting to me, and I always really appreciated the fact when someone came with this kind of attitude of there was an issue that they needed to communicate, but they came as a problem solver and not just coming to complain about something. So I think this is an important one to think through, especially again if you're communicating something that there needs to be an improvement on, or you're dissatisfied with something. Don't just complain, be ready with solutions as well. So the final area that I want to talk about is communicating at home. And on this one, I did some research, as I always do for these topics, and I found an article that I really liked, and this was from Dr. John Grohol, and it's 9 steps to better communications today. And I give the citing here where you can find it if you want to look at it yourself, and I recommend that you do that. It's a fairly long article, 4 or 5 pages, and I've taken some tips from it, the 9 tips that he communicates here, and so I'll talk about those. But again, I recommend, if you're interested, to go ahead and find the source article and dig a little deeper there. So the first rule or tip that he has is stop and listen, and I don't think we need to spend too much time on that because we've talked about that already in the presentation as far as active listening is concerned, but he reinforces that message, and particularly when it's a serious discussion, that we really need to kind of put our agenda aside and listen to what the other person has to say. That's very important. And likewise with the second one, forcing yourself to hear, that's also important. And I talked before about paraphrasing. He's a psychiatrist, psychologist. If you've ever dealt with a counselor or a health coach, they use a technique that's similar to that. They call it reflection, and he talks about it in the article, but it's very much the same thing. It's kind of you reflecting to the person what you thought they said and what you heard, and that can help make sure that everybody's clear. Now he does bring up an important point, is that you have to be careful with this particular technique, the paraphrasing or reflecting, and that you don't want to overuse that, because that can sort of turn someone off in the conversation and frustrate them that you're always repeating what they say. So use that sparingly, but it is a good tool to keep in mind. The third one, being open and honest with your partner. This is tied up in rule number 4. Saying what we don't want is not the same as saying what we do want. And so that being open and honest is certainly an important quality to have when you're communicating at home, with your loved ones. And I'll quote him directly here. Some people have never been very open or honest to others in their life, and some people may not even know themselves or know much about their own real needs and desires, and yet we're asking them to be that to someone else. But to be in a relationship is to take a step toward opening up your life and opening up yourself. So being open and honest, again, is an important quality or attribute if you want to have effective communications with the people that you care about. The fourth tip here that he has, pay attention to nonverbal communications and nonverbal skills. We talked about that in our other settings, but let's think of it a little bit differently this time. Not only what your body language is saying, but your ability to interpret someone else's body language. And he gives some ideas here, some things to look out for. That is, if the person's arms are folded in front of you, they may be feeling defensive or closed off. If they're not looking at you directly in the eye, it may mean that they're not really interested in what you're saying, or they could be ashamed of something or find it difficult to talk about that particular thing. So the lack of eye contact can be telling. Louder, more aggressive tones in someone's voice may mean that the conversation is escalating and it's becoming too emotional. So keep that in mind, the tone of your voice, and if you feel yourself getting louder, try to tone it down. Stay focused in the here and now. I think that's an important one, and we all sort of have a tendency to do that, I think, sometimes, particularly when we're in a heated discussion with our loved one, in that we can sort of veer off topic, and it becomes about something that we did last week or last month, or that we're thinking of for the future, and we move away from being here and now. So again, it's important to stay in the moment. Try to minimize emotion when talking about important big decisions. And again, we've talked about that on the last slide, with staying calm. I think that's really critical at our home communications as well. That we have to kind of be aware of that and pick the right time to have the right type of conversation. And that's also tied up in the next one. Be ready to cede an argument, or in other words, be ready to kind of give in, if you will. And we have to ask ourselves, is it more important for us to be right, or is it more important for us to have good communication with our loved one? And sometimes you have to say, well, it's more important for us to have this good conversation and for us both to feel good about it than for me to feel like I won or that I was right. So again, be ready to cede an argument. Tip number 8, humor and playfulness usually help. I'm a huge believer in that. I think that having a good sense of humor and trying to lighten up particularly a serious conversation with a little bit of humor, maybe if it's even at your own expense, it really does help to bring down the tension of a difficult conversation. So use humor where you can. It will make a difference in the quality of your communication. And number 9, the final one, communicating is more than just talking. And there's a lot to that. Yes, we've talked this whole presentation about kind of the verbal side of things, although we've talked about the nonverbal a little bit as well. But communication is, it's comprehensive, and it's not only what we say, but it's what we do. It's not only the verbal communication in a conversation that we have, with our loved ones, but today we have the ability to email, to text, all different kinds of ways of communicating. And I think it's important to pull those into our communication strategy, particularly with our loved ones. And so maybe sending a text once or twice throughout the day to your loved one, just to let them know that you're thinking about them, or to ask how their day is going. All of that is a part of our communication profile with our loved one. So keep that in mind as well. So we're at the end here. I apologize, I've gone over a little bit with this month's presentation as well. I'm going to have to work on that, try to pull that back a little bit, but this is an important topic, communication, for all of us. So I hope that you've got something from the tips and the techniques that we discussed today, and as always, I appreciate your time and attention with the session. Remember, with all of these, the little quiz questions that are at the bottom of the page here, that you check those off so that you get credit for your time this afternoon. And I look forward to talking with you next month, and wish you the very best of communication skills at work, at home, and with everyone that you come in contact with. Thanks so much.